Hi folks, welcome to this bonus episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. This first appeared as a freebie for my Patreons, but now it's forming part of the single episodes that take an overlook and that give both an introduction and then an overview of the book of Judges that you have been studying or that we're about to study. And this is the introduction, the single episode to look at the entire book of Judges. The title I've given it, or the title rather that I've given to this book of Judges, I call Judges the book of apostasy. The book of Judges, it stands as one of the most sobering narratives in Scripture. It really calls our attention because it chronicles a spiritual and a moral decline, one that is following on from the triumphs of the previous book of Joshua. It stands in stark contrast. It is both jarring in that contrast, but also it is instructive. It's a warning, in fact. Where in the book of Joshua, we saw a book of conquest, we saw covenant renewal, we saw divine faithfulness. In Judges, it will tell a story of compromise. Covenants, promises ignored and neglected, and in fact out and out human rebellion against God and God's plan for the nation of Israel. In fact, the previous book of the Old Testament, that book Joshua, ended with a call to faithfulness. It finished by saying, "Choose this day whom you will serve." Well, we'll find out how that works out for the nation of Israel. And Judges begins the very next verse in the Bible. The very first verse of Judges chapter 1 verse 1 says, "Who shall go up first against the Canaanite?" A question in itself that reveals, gives us a glimpse of the very beginning of a sort of faltering in resolve. The victories of Joshua are not going to be sustained into this book. Not because God has changed, not because God's promise has changed, but because the people did, as the Judges revealed, what they wanted in their own eyes. The Judges reveals what happens when a generation fails to pass on the knowledge of God to the next generation. The result is not merely stagnation, but spiritual regression and their oppression. It contains within this book a sort of cycle of apostasy. So Judge is not just sad, it is cyclical in its sadness. The book is structured around a repeated pattern. That pattern has been identified by many as making up of 5 components. Sin, first of all, Israel turns from gods to idols. Then that leads to servitude. God allows foreign oppression to come in, enemies of Israel to take over and control them, which leads to their supplication and the people crying out in distress. But then salvation comes in that God raises up a judge, one of these leaders, to deliver them. And then there's a period of silence. Peace returns until the cycle unfortunately begins again. This downward spiral that we're witnessing here is not just historical, it's spiritual, theological. It reveals the consequences for people who are unfaithful to the promise God has given them. Unfaithful to the mercy of a God who, even though he repeatedly intervenes, they don't take it on board. And God does that intervention not because of the people's merit, but because of his side of that covenant, that promise to love. And in it we will witness 8 generations of decline. You'll discover as we work through this book that the consequences span 8 generations of the nation of Israel, 8 cycles, this cycle of apostasy, and then the rising up for deliverance again. And this is significant because it shows that sin is never a static thing. It's like a cancer. It grows and it metastasizes. The failure of one generation becomes the bondage of the next. Judges 2 verse 19 captures for us this haunting reality when it says, "But when the judge died, they turned their back and were more corrupt than ever their fathers." From my perspective, this is therefore for Christians meant to stand as a call to vigilance. The book warns us against the consequences of spiritual compromise, even in the smallest degree, because that is the thing that can lead to generational upon generational devastation. It's a reminder that faith must be cultivated, curated, and then passed on intentionally to the next generation. But the title, Judges, what were these judges? Well, the title, it doesn't refer to courtroom officials that we might think of it in these days, but to these people who are divinely appointed leaders, deliverers raised up by God in a time of crisis. They are civil and military leaders. And yeah, that's true, but more importantly, they're instruments of divine mercy. Now, they're flawed people as well, some very deeply flawed. Think Samson and Jephthah you'll meet. But they're also chosen people. But they're chosen not for their strength, but for their use for God's purposes. They're people who are temporarily raised up for a season and pointing to the need overall of a permanent Redeemer to come one day. So in this way, the judges serve as sort of types, prototypes, imperfect shadows of the ultimate judge, Saviour and Deliverer, Jesus Christ. Where they will bring temporary peace, Christ is foreshadowed as the one needed to bring eternal redemption. So who is the author and who was it written to? Well, the authorship is technically anonymous, but it's still written with a clear purpose, that's for sure. The book of Judges itself does not name its author, but it's worth noting that Jewish tradition, specifically the Talmud, attributes its authorship to the prophet Samuel. While we can't be dogmatic about this, friends, the attribution is both reasonable, plausible, and is, of course, theologically and spiritually significant if that's so. Samuel is seen as a transitional figure. He's the last of the judges and the prophet who anointed Israel's first king when they entered into that new phase of leadership, if you like. Samuel lived in a time of spiritual awakening, but a transition time. He was the one who was calling Israel back to its covenant faithfulness. Now, he had access to historical records and oral traditions, making him a fitting compiler of Israel's turbulent past. If not Samuel himself, the author is recognized to be likely one of his prophetic school, one of his prophetic disciples, someone committed to preserving Israel's history with spiritual intent. Now, experts have dated this book and they place it somewhere between Saul and David. Now, the text itself provides internal evidence, a compelling window in which we can date the book. One clue, a big clue, is of course that it records Samson's death in Judges chapter 16. Therefore, by implication, tying it in with other things, this means the book must have been written after 1051 BC. Furthermore, the repeated use of the phrase, "in those days there was no king of Israel," of course suggests that the monarchy during the period this was written had begun. Otherwise mention that in the past there was no king. Also, Judges 1 verse 2 tells us that the Jebusites were still in Jerusalem when it was being written. This means it must be before David's conquest of that place in 1004 BC. So by pulling these statements and facts together, it means the most likely date for composition of the book is between 1043 BC, which is Saul's coronation as king, and 1004 BC, David's capture of Jerusalem, with many scholars actually setting on the earlier date of around 1040 BC. Now, this dating is important because it's not merely an academic discipline, it's spiritually important because, as I said, it means the book was written during a time of national transition, that period when Israel was grappling with the need for a centralized leadership politically but still under divine guidance. Now, some critics point out some apparent inconsistencies in the timeline, noting that the cumulative years of the judges would seem to exceed the historical window that the events take within. However, this is easily resolved if we recognize three factors. Firstly, some judges very likely ruled concurrently in different regions and overlapped with each others. Israel was, after all, a sort of what we would identify today as a sort of tribal confederation, not a unified state that would have allowed for overlapping leadership, a bit like the Native Americans in the USA prior to the arrival of Europeans. The book is a theological, spiritual history as well. It was never meant to be a modern chronology, as we would call it today. Its purpose was to prioritize spiritual lessons over just simply strict historical timelines. If you understand these perspectives, then you are at the same time preserving both the integrity of a biblical view of Scripture and its coherence as a reasonable historical record. Now, who was the original audience? Well, the recipients of the book of Judges were clearly the Israelites themselves, living either, as I said, just before or just after the establishment of the monarchy, during that period of transition. The repeated refrain, in those days there was no king of Israel, and everyone did as was right in his own eyes, we see that repeatedly, is more than just a historical note. It's a spiritual indictment of the state of the people. It reveals moral relativism. It shows a society becoming untethered from the divine authority and ordinance they were given. It also underscores the need for godly leadership, not just of any king, but one who could rule for them on their behalf under God's law. And it also anticipates the Davidic covenant, the promise made to David pointing forward to a righteous king who would come and shepherd God's people. Now, Christians, of course, believe this longing for a king is ultimately found its fulfillment, not in Saul or David, who are transitional human figures, but in fact in Jesus Christ, the true and eternal king, the one who will ultimately bring perfect order, justice, well, indeed, redemption of the people. So, the message of the book. Well, this book of Judges, as I said, in its history spans 2 centuries. It's following on from Joshua's conquest of Canaan through Israel having entered the land victorious, and then we find them failing to obey. God's command to drive out the Canaanites is done, but it's not done completely. The incomplete obedience of failing to do that has devastating consequences, and those consequences are religious, spiritual, in the sense that the Canaanites that remained introduced seductive and idolatrous practices, things like Baal worship, fertility cults, ritualized sexuality and immorality, but it also had a political effect. Israel became more and more fragmented and vulnerable to oppression from the surrounding nations, literally a form of divide and conquer, which then sets the stage for the recurring drama of Judges, this cycle of sin, suffering, calling out to Lord, and then temporary salvation again through a judge being raised up. Many have called this the sin cycle, the pattern of apostasy. Now, at the beginning, Judges 2 verse 11 to verse 19 provides the overview lens through which this entire book can be read. It outlines for us, for the first time, the tragic pattern that will define Israel's spiritual condition again and again through this book. Let me remind you and point it out just in that opening few verses. First of all, Judges 2:11, apostasy. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Then 2 verse 14, the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. He sold them into the hands of the enemies. Then there is the crying out. They groaned under their bondage and cried out to the Lord. That's 2 verse 15. And then 2:16, their deliverance. The Lord raised up a judge who delivered them. And then the relapse again, 2:19, but when the judge dies, they reverted and behaved corruptly again. So that's the cycle. For the first time in just those opening, 8-9 verses, a cycle that will be repeated over and over again. But the cycle is not just historical, friends. Remember, it's spiritual also. It is there to reveal the consequences of being unfaithful to God's promises to us, being unfaithful to the very character of God, yet in it we still see God again and again being merciful, being holy, but being patient. The judges, that as they appear, then rise up and appear, but they're not merely military, political heroes. They're instruments of God's own divine judgment and God's mercy as well, of course. Each one raised up by God to, first of all, defeat Israel's enemies, executing judgment on those oppressors, then to restore covenant order again, guiding the people back to God's law, and doing it in a way that foreshadows Christ to come. They're human beings, but they're imperfect human beings. So in that in of itself and the repeated failure, that points to the need for one day a perfect divine deliverer. Now, some judges like Deborah and Gideon, they are seen to lead with courage and faith. Others like Samson are shown to be deeply flawed individuals. Yet in every case, God uses these ordinary broken vessels, as they're called, to accomplish his main redemptive purpose. And that is the theme that resonates powerfully with anyone who takes a biblical and evangelical approach to theology. So what's the core message? Well, the clear theological core of Judges is both clear and a sobering warning. Judges 2:13, they forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtaroths. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, for it grieved him because of their groaning. That's 2:16 and 18. So here we have the timeless pattern, the timeless truth revealed. Sin leads to degradation, which leads to immorality, and that degradation is revealed in our moral outlook, our spiritual outlook, and our political social outlook. False ideologies enslave, whether they're the ancient Canaanites from years ago or modern secularism and other ideologies that are rising today. But yet God's mercy is greater than our individual or collective failures, because he hears us, and when we cry out, he delivers and he restores. So Judges is not just a warning, it's also a testament to God's grace. Even in the darkest chapters of this book, and there are some very dark waters, murky waters to wade through, God's covenant love will be seen to shine through. The book will ultimately point forward to the need for a righteous king, one who will not die, one who will not leave the people to relapse, and one who reigns eternally. And we know, as Christian believers, that is Jesus Christ, the true judge and deliverer. Let me give you a quick overview of the structure of the book before I close. Okay, the book is not in chronological order. It's important to say that. Chapters 17 to 21 precede the events in chapter 3 to 16. The literary structure revolves around the repeated phrase, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. That prefigures each section. We hear it in chapter 3:7, 3:12, 4:1, 6:12, 10:6 and 13:1, all through that section of the cycling of the sins. The book then reaches a climax in chapter 17 to 21, with the very last verses being a fitting climax and conclusion of the whole book. Now, this book of Judges was written to warn a newly crowned generation in Israel that their departure from the Lord would lead, not what they thought in their eyes to a form of freedom, but in fact to defeat and degeneration. This repeated refrain, in those eyes there was no king in Israel, because everybody did what was right in their own eyes. It's not a lament. It's meant to be taken as a spiritual diagnosis of the spiritual state of the nation at that point. It shows that defection from God leads ultimately to moral chaos. It also shows that autonomy, that type of freedom without an authority behind it, will actually lead to societal collapse, and that the absence of godly leadership can lead a whole nation to spiritual ruin. Now, Samuel, or one of his prophetic students at least, penned this book to show Israel's need for a king. And that need was not merely political, but spiritual as well. And that's the important thing. Yet even in this and all their repeated rebellions, we see that God does not abandon them. The book of Judges was written to a generation who are standing at the crossroads. Israel had or was about to have its first king, but it needed more than a political throne. It needed a heart turned back to God. So the message is clear and it's timeless in the sense that it's not just for them today. It can benefit us today. It tells us that departure from the Lord will ultimately lead to defeat and depravity amongst the people. But God in his grace delivers us when we turn back towards him, individually and I believe collectively. Judges is not just a record of these rebellions. It is also meant to be a record, a testimony to the repeated mercy and grace of God. Again and again, Israel will fall, and again, God will raise them up. He will give them a judge and a deliverer, not because they've earned it, not because they've deserved it, not even because they've particularly changed, but because he is faithful and he answers when they cry out. So the pattern, let me remind you, it's familiar then and it's familiar today. The sin of people will lead to slavery, spiritual servitude. That servitude will lead people into a sense of sorrow. That sorrow will lead people to eventually surrender themselves over and cry out to God. In fact, it is only that surrendering to self that opens the door to salvation. That's the rhythm of Judges, and that's the rhythm of God's grace revealed in it. It's a story of a God who doesn't give up on his people, even when they've given up on him. So in summary, Judges is a book that shows us of the divine patience and the persistent mercy of God. Through Israel's repeated turning away, God repeatedly raises up deliverers. Through they demanding a king, God then chooses to graciously grant one, not because they deserve it, but simply because he's faithful. Departure from the Lord will always lead to defeat, which will lead to depravity. But God, in his grace, delivers his people when we turn back to him. Sin does indeed lead to slavery. We only need to look around us to see that. But surrender and obedience brings freedom and salvation. This is the gospel in miniature. God shows us that God's grace is greater than any of our rebellions, no matter how terrible they are, and that true freedom is in fact not found in doing what we feel is right in our own eyes, but in surrendering to what is right in God's eyes and revealed by him to be right. In those days, there was no king in Israel, the book of Judges tells us. That's a refrain throughout the book. And it isn't just a historical story, it's a prophetic word, I believe. It points forward to the need for a righteous ruler, one who would die but would be raised to life again and would never leave the people to relapse without the potential of forgiveness. One who is able to do that because he reigns forever. I think the book of Judges reveals that we still need a king, but we need a king who has, for us today, already come and is with us still today. A king who will do it not in the strength of Samson, not in the wisdom of Deborah, not even in the courage of Gideon, but in something else completely, in a new way, a new covenant, a New Testament way, by the humility of Jesus Christ, God's only Son, who bore our judgment, broke our bondage, and now reigns in righteousness for us. So, as you and I begin this journey through the book of Judges, let me ask you, have you ever felt stuck in a cycle of failure? Then this book is going to help you. Have you ever watched a culture unravel before your eyes and wondered where God is in it? This book will help you understand that. Have you ever longed for a leadership that will bring justice and peace and truth on this earth? Then this book is indeed for you. Now, let's be clear. This book is gritty, it's raw, it's real, it's soaked through with violence in a more of an extreme than anywhere else in any other book of the Bible, but it's there to show us the repercussions of sin. Just because something is recorded doesn't mean that God approves of it. We don't blame the BBC for the news. We don't blame whoever you receive your news from in the UK for the depravity of the news. but it shows us the repercussions of sin. But it is also drenched throughout with God's grace, because even in the darkest days we see that God is still at work. Even when we fall, he will still raise his people up, and even when we cry out in the depths of the darkness, he hears. So as you prepare to do this journey through the book of Judges, hopefully verse by verse, judge by judge with me, remember this: learn from its warnings, marvel at its mercy, but fix your eyes on the future king, the one king who will never fail. Judges is not just a book of ancient history. It's a book of living theology that we can apply into our lives. It has within it that call to repentance. It has within it a warning against compromise, but it also has within it a celebration of God's relentless grace towards us. And I think it reminds us that we still need a king, and not just any king, but the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, who will be revealed through the history of this nation as we continue through the Old Testament. But at this point, be prepared for a journey through one of the most raw, real, but yet redemptive books in the Bible. One that tells us that even in the darkest days, friends, God is still at work, and he is still calling his people back to himself. Enjoy the journey. Thanks for being with me. Okay, it's 8:31. I've got to fly, I've got to go. Thanks for being with me. Thank you, Patreons. This part of it only you will see. I really appreciate everything you do by being part of this community, your prayerful support and otherwise. And this will eventually appear as a separate playlist in those 66 books on YouTube and perhaps a few other places, but it will appear in audio version. Okay, bye-bye for now. See you soon.